Jayanna Killingsworth.
This meeting is being recorded.
And I think y'all all just got the heads up about the recording. So yeah, my name is Jayanna Killingsworth. I conducted the climate reality training in the summer of 2020, the first hybrid event, or the first totally online event, should I say. And since then, I have participated with the European group of climate reality. I did help organize the Fit for 55 conference that we had back in February, as well as help kind of gear the business interest group forward in some of the decisions and directions. And this is actually one of the offshoots from that. Additionally, I am currently a PhD candidate focusing on sustainability education. And I'm looking at how cultural and creative industries can help to expand the advancements of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So I came across this EnRoads tool as what I think is an amazing complement to both our climate reality training, as well as how we can provide visualization tools in different business and consulting scenarios to help, again, direct people towards creating more sustainable and effective management practices when it comes to energy usages. So we are going to start off right now. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we're going to start with a kind of a small introduction. And so, again, just to kind of reiterate, we are all climate reality leaders. Some of us are coming from a business perspective. Some of us are coming strictly from a leadership perspective. And so with some of the goals with our session today is to really kind of create the relevance between what we're given within our climate reality training and how this open access tool, Inroads, can really help take some of the information, some of the knowledge to the next level. And you'll see how I've started incorporating that with some of our publicly available slides that are provided to us through climate reality. We are also going to actually be working with the Inroads tool today, and we're going to work on building a scenario to see a possible ways of reducing the overall global temperature. And we are going to kind of look at it today from more of a business lens, because there are multiple ways that you can approach how you utilize this tool. And a lot of it has to do with what kind of information you're hoping to glean, what kind of audience you're utilizing. And then at the end of this, we will have hopefully a lively discussion regarding the opportunities of not only our climate reality training, but how we can utilize Inroads in our networks and our own initiatives. So as we know from our training, the global surface temperature has just continued to increase exponentially over the last few decades, with the last approximately 25 years being some of the hottest ever recorded on record. We've also come to learn that a large portion of this is directly related to the pollution from the burning of fossil fuels. This pollution gets trapped in our atmosphere, which is ultimately causing the continued exacerbation and warming. And so we do know that this is anthropocentric. We do know that we are directly responsible for the things that are occurring. And it has also been proven over the last couple of decades that there are renewable energy options that can alleviate big percentages of our fossil fuel usage. Wind, as we see here, is one example of the ability to move away from some of our coal, oil, possible gas when it comes to electricity usage. We also know that there is enough solar energy that reaches the earth to power all of our needs for a full year. However, we understand too that with both of these sources, we do need storage capacity. It is not a situation to where we can just plug in a solar panel and be done with it, right? We do need capacities to store and house and transfer that electricity. And so what we've also seen within the renewable markets is that our ability for storage is continuing to increase. And again, we can see within the next approximately 20 years, our ability and storage capacities will exponentially continue to grow. And so these three factors between wind, solar, and storage capacity has the ability to offset large swaths of our fossil fuel usage. There are multiple other debated technologies that we will be discussing in EnRoads. And I do want to point out that from a climate reality standpoint, renewables and fully sustainable technologies such as the solar and wind are what is officially advocated through climate reality. And so with these other debated technologies, depending on what your personal standpoints are, possibly what country you're in, that is going to go beyond what we are discussing today, minus the fact that these are other things that are available and are being utilized in various degrees. So we are going to kind of remove ourselves from our personal preferences to look at the overall picture of everything that is available that could be utilized. But please, again, keep in mind that climate reality does specifically only advocate renewable and fully sustainable options. So just with this little bit of introductory information and utilizing some of our publicly available slides that are available to all of us, how can we take all of this into consideration, not only within our own personal networks, our own choices, but within our businesses, whether we run our own, whether we are part of a leadership group within an organization. And one of the things that we can begin to look at is what is considered a bathtub model, right? And so we have all these emissions going out, CO2 being the largest culprit, but not the only culprit, right? But it is one of the more focused on of the greenhouse gases. So we've created a situation to where we've essentially filled up our atmospheric bathtub with all of this CO2, right? And just like a bathtub, it generally takes longer to empty the bathtub than it does to fill it, right? And we can't say start removing if we're continuing to pump in, because we're not going to make very much of a dent. And likewise, we can't completely plug it while still keeping our faucet on. And so when we think about all emissions, not just CO2, this is one of the best analogies to think about is how are we not only filling our bathtub, how are we emptying our bathtub? Because the most logical thing is, right, turn off the spigot. So the emissions stop flowing into the atmosphere, and it gives us as a global society the opportunities to focus on the removal and emptying our bathtub. And this is another way that the Inroads tool is really going to help us look and understand, because there are so many direct and indirect consequences of continued buildup of CO2 within our atmosphere. And the list beyond just extreme weather events, political instability, famines, infectious diseases, the mass of climate refugees. Beyond that, there are so many systemic issues, right? That just the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere create, and they are direct as well as indirect implications, which is another important factor to understand when we have these type of conversations, is that it is not a linear process. It is not just a single cause and a single effect with nothing in between. There are so many webs of interconnectedness. And even when we talk about, again, a lot of times a big focus has been on carbon, but when we look at the overall nature, especially from an industrialized standpoint, there are a whole host of greenhouse gases that are also part of the problem. It is not just this standalone as CO2, right? And then we can see within this diagram that so many of these output sources are interconnected with each other, which is another very good benefit about utilizing this Inroads tool, is that it lets us start to think in systems, right? Instead of having multiple disconnected points, we are looking for that interconnected nature. We're not seeing things as just this linear A to B, but there are full cycle situations that happen. One of my favorite out of all of these different ways to really start thinking in systems is the puzzle analogy, right? While we talk about carbon or greenhouse gases or even instabilities and extreme weather events, they are all parts of this bigger whole picture, right? And so while we may have focuses on a singular point in our own initiatives or directions, or just like today, we are specifically focusing on energy and the various uses of energy, they are not standalone, right? And so it's something that always needs to be considered, that this is all interconnectedness. There's all kinds of relationships that are happening simultaneously within these systems. And so sometimes there are opportunities of connection and collaboration, but there's also opportunities for competition or things that may seem logical on the surface, but once you start looking at the relationships of the interconnectedness, can at times defeat its own purpose. And that could, an easy example is some of the other contested technologies that are out there. And so just to give you a little bit better idea about EnRoads, it was developed with Climate Interactive and MIT, utilizing up-to-date scientific information from institutions all around the world. Some of these institutions include the IPCC, the UN, the IEA, and the EIEE. But these are not limited to these, but these are definitely some of the main referencing points. And they aggregated all of this information to provide us with baseline scenarios that we see. And another benefit to the Inroads tool and the additional suite of tools that Climate Interactive offers is that they constantly maintain and keep the science up to date within the tools themselves. And before we switch over to the actual tool itself, I just kind of wanted you to see the 18 different categories that we will be looking at today. Some of them focus more on policies, for example, carbon pricing. Some of them focus on how to reduce the use of traditional fossil fuels. Some of them provide opportunities to look at what altering certain levels of infrastructure could provide. And some of them also include certain technologies that aren't necessarily here yet and that aren't or are not at a point of scalability. So all of these take into consideration the full landscape of the energy sector, sectors and the interdependencies of all of this. And so maybe I'll just take a couple more minutes to look at this, and y'all should have also received a copy of this while preparing for this meeting, but we will also make sure to include it in our follow-up packet as well. And then with that, I'm going to move us straight into the actual dashboard. So this is the full Inroads dashboard. Again, here at the bottom, you can see all the 18 points that we went across, that we briefly went over just a minute ago. In the graph that you see on your right-hand side, this is our baseline scenario. So this is currently, if everything stays at status quo, this is the continued increase that we can expect to see with greenhouse gas emissions through the year 2100. And this is the projected temperature increase that we can expect should this remain exactly as it is today. In the screen to the left-hand side, you can see currently what the global sources of energy are. So you can see coal right down here towards the bottom, oil next, and then gas, which currently do still take up a large swath. Consider we're right here, a large swath of the energy sources that are being used around the world. I mean, because you can see followed up by renewables here in the green, bioenergy, little bit of nuclear up here at the top, and then new zero technologies are pretty much currently non-existent. And just to give you another idea about Inroads that is a little beyond what we're going to get into today, partially just because of our time availability, is there are numerous graphs that you can look at within this simulation tool. Again, a lot more than what we are going to be able to get into at this current moment, but I highly suggest you go in and on your own time and really start digging around, especially if you have a specialized focus that you want to look at, or you have research or particular initiatives, or your business organization happens to fall into a specific sector that could really take advantage of some of these additional views that we can see. In the past, one other session that I've done with the Inroads was focusing specifically on equality and disparages around the world for what certain initiatives and policies can create. For example, the price of electricity based on certain initiatives, right? So again, you can see there's endless, and these are also constantly being updated. The removals and land use, this particular one is one of the newest additions. And again, we can see multiple ones. This impact is another newer one that we can see. Again, by certain sectors and even around the world, we can see with sea level rise and the risks maps, because it's also going to tie into equity to refugee situations. So I highly encourage to take deeper dives in what we're going to do today. In addition to that, within each of these levers, which are right now, they look like they're off, but they're not, because they're set at what our baseline status quo is. So for afforestation, for example, the efforts that are going on around the world are actually quite small, right? So it's starting over here on the far side, whereas deforestation efforts are well underway and beyond, way beyond what needs to be. And so that's why you see this one higher up. And so we will go through deciding when and how to move those. But another area that I want you to know within your own research and scenario building is next to each one, you will see these 3 dots. And what they do is they bring up a whole other series to where you can really even further drill down. And that includes for renewables, for example, the amount of taxes or subsidies that could be applied. This is especially good if you're working in any sort of policy situation, as well as the year subsidies begin or the year that they stop. And each one of those is going to have its own direct implications and its own ability to further zero in on specific scenarios and policies that work with the audience or group in which you're working with. And again, we can see it here. Every single one of them has varying degrees of whether it be when certain things start, when certain things stop, whatever sort of subsidies. And it provides you with its own graph of what can happen, and also provides you with related graphs if you want to find related information, but perhaps the big list of graphs could be overwhelming. And then there is also an information section for further examples, key messages, things to consider. And so this is going to happen within every single one. And these also dig deeper into some of the science that is gathered to create these baselines. And again, it does go a little beyond what just our introductory section is, but we are going to build a scenario today. And so the first thing that I would like you all to do is take a minute and think about, out of these 18 different sections and lever possibilities that we have, what do you feel is the most important one to focus on, either based on your own beliefs or based on a current business situation that you are in? So examples could include, I believe we should grow more trees, that is the most important thing, or my company is currently looking at how to increase efficient electricity efficiency within our brick and mortar buildings. So just take a minute and think about that, and feel free to add them into the chat or unmute and speak aloud. I do have a lovely assistant, Gosia, in the background that is fielding the chats. So whichever you are comfortable with, and I'll give you a minute to think about that.
Hi there, this is Gosha. So we already have the first answer in the chat box. So Jordi has mentioned carbon tax.
Okay, very good. That will be a wonderful place to begin, and we find that under the carbon price. So let's say we want to be just generally advantageous, and we want the highest possible carbon tax as soon as possible, right? Which if we just move these main levers, that means that it would be something that enacted immediately. So if we start at a place of carbon pricing and carbon taxation, I want you to all think about how much we went as high as we could, as soon as we could. How much do you think the temperature would reduce itself by just that action alone? And again, feel free to speak up or put it into the chat. Because this is also a good way to balance assumptions and expectations with the reality of science. So there's no wrong answer in this situation. So feel free to just provide the number that you think. And I want to get at least one number before I move the lever.
So we have 0.9 grades or one degree. So pretty similar.
Okay. I think that is an excellent guess. And so now we are going to fully move the lever all the way up, and we're going to see what happens. I think that was a pretty accurate guess. And we can also see, just with that action alone, how immediate and dramatic the changes are. And that has a lot to do with the fact that it is something that can be enacted immediately. It does not require years of scaling technologies, building infrastructure, rerouting, and grids. It does not require any of that. It is a very essentially signing a few documents, to put it extremely simply, right? But it can have huge impacts. I mean, we can see here, I mean, especially when you look at coal, how coal just completely drops to close to negligible, right? And it also provides widening opportunity for an increase in renewables to come into the picture. Now we can see that it even does reduce biofuels, slightly increases the possibility of nuclear. Natural gas stays about the same, and oil does slowly start to reduce.
So we actually have two voices in favor of phasing out fossil fuels or reducing natural gas supply as much as possible, and then pushing for renewables. So actually those two talk about the same thing. But before we go there, I think that it would be important to mention two questions that popped up in the chat. So does the tool take into account possible dependencies between different variables? So for instance, bioenergy could also increase deforestation if you cut down trees to create biogas from canola, for instance.
Absolutely. It absolutely does provide scenarios within those sort of situations. So we're not going to get completely lost in it, but yes, it does take into account, and that is an excellent question, not only for the capabilities of this tool, but for thinking in systems, right? Like, are these complementing other renewable or sustainable options, or are these competing against their own goods by forcing, especially developing countries, global South countries, into still having to use fossil fuels, right? So is it creating equity? Is it accounting for these different sort of changes? And so for an example, we can see with this particular one how it does drop. And again, you can start going into with the bioenergy, because it is not considered renewable for the exact reason that was just mentioned, right? Because it's not a fully renewable, right? We're still clearing out and utilizing land for monoculture situations, which increases biodiversity. It increases and exacerbates certain multiple social environmental situations, right? And so again, we can dig into other graphs and see some of those impacts. Now going back to the ideas of, I believe I heard renewables first and then natural gas.
Yeah, it was phasing out fossil fuels and replacing it with renewables first. And then we also have one comment. I just want to make sure that we keep up with the chat. So there's one more comment, which was upvoted by a few participants, coming from Itzel. I think they are all important, but I think that to really have an impact on reducing climate change, we also have to stop having a growth mentality. For example, we can have increased forestation and renewable energy, but if we continue to produce in an unstoppable way, it makes no sense, because more forests will still be cut down and more energy will be needed. So just to add another voice regarding economic growth.
Another element, absolutely. And those definitely need to be taken into account. And we can actually look at what happens in both of those situations, say population grows beyond what is calculated and expected, and the desire for economic growth continues. We can definitely look at both of those, because again, that's another prime example of how this needs to be understood in a systematic way, right? And how these play on each other, and even the type of renewables that are utilized depending on where you are in the world, because a lot of times they do also take up land, correct? So and population, it's one of those kind of sticky subjects depending on who you're talking to and what your own ethical viewpoints are. I think that it kind of falls into one of those heated places that are similar to nuclear, which within this particular situation, I am not going to form any one opinion or not, because we are working on scenario buildings with what we know and what we have, right? And so we are definitely going to take a look at that increase. But I think that what we should look at first is what happens, what would happen if we increased our renewables, reduced our fossil fuels, and then it was a situation of population increase and economic growth. I think that that is a adequate order to go into to see whether there are the major changes. And so I'm going to go next to the renewables. And again, I'm going to assume that we want to go all the way with it. And again, I would like to ask for some number guesses of how much more we think that we could reduce if we were on top of our carbon taxing to increase subsidies and availabilities of renewables as far as possible. Do we have any guesses coming through? No guesses?
We still have a debate on GDP and the economic growth in the comments.
Yes, this is, and that's one thing that I do want to kind of reiterate within the workshop, because there's so many great conversations that can happen around each and every one of these 18 levers. And I think that it's very important, especially when utilizing this tool within your own initiatives and scenarios, to consider all of the ramifications of each of these situations. However,
sorry, if I just may briefly chip in, it's not so much about the lever per se, but there's a fundamental assumption built into that lever, which is our current interpretation of what economic growth and GDP means in terms of success and so on and so forth. And that in itself is a questionable assumption to build in a tool, because that economic system, I mean, every one of us here knows donut economics and all the other sort of critique points around that. So it can be quite dangerous to build something like that into a tool like this without having yet another lever to change those kind of interpretations around of what actually growth and success means in that context.
Yes, absolutely. I think that those are all extremely important and viable topics. And just so we can all see specifically what some of the details are when it's considering the economic growth as measured by the GDP. We can see some of the things that they take into consideration, which is your long-term economic growth, near-term, and transitional time. And I do also understand that there are dangers in making these statements in just black and white, and some of the implications that are underlined with what that actually means in a broader, especially social content. I mean, not only environmentally, but the social content. And in no way does this tool replace the broad range of grayscale that's involved with these particular two topics that are, again, often highly charged. But all it can do is acknowledge that these are also very relevant points to go about how decisions are made, and some of the science and modeling behind the assumptions associated with the two. So in a lot of especially personal situations, there is ethics and morals that we follow, and I am not personally here to say that this is the right way, this is the wrong way. But I think that at the same time, to totally discount those two particular topics kind of does somewhat of a disservice to, again, the overall systematic concept and interplay that all of this, that all of these decisions rely on. So I don't necessarily know if that was an acceptable answer, but it is what we do have, again, to work with, because these concepts have been quantified, right? And so without going too much further into the precarious nature of the underlying implications of those, I do want to steer us back to the idea of the scenario if we are to increase our renewables. And I do also suggest that these type of conversations would also be amazing to have within the new Climate Reality Hub. And because I think that they do need to be talked about. Dialogue and discussion is extremely important. But I am hoping at this moment that somebody can give me a numerical guess of how much more they think the temperature could be reduced if we, again, all of our fossil fuels are still at our status quo point, but we were to increase the availabilities and subsidies surrounding renewables. How much more of a reduction do you think could occur? Does anybody have any guesses? No guesses with this one?
1 more degree, 1.5, 0.6. So a bit varying here.
Very good. All right. Well, let us turn it all the way up and we'll find out who's closest, right? It didn't really do a lot at all. Does anybody want to chime in with why they think that is? No? Well, there's still that question of the remaining fossil fuel that is at play. Like we can extend and subsidize and create all of this wider use of renewables. But at the end of the day, especially within this next 10-year situation, there's the usage would still essentially be the same. Again, you're looking at especially developing countries, global South countries that still have this high reliance on these fossil fuel sources. And so we will go with the next suggestions of starting to completely phase out some of these fossil fuels, and we will start with the natural gas. And so I want you to think about, I won't ask for each individual one as I do each individual one, but with all three options essentially removed from the sources of primary energy and renewables all the way to the top, and our carbon price or carbon taxation so high, what do you think the temperature drop or change would be with the complete removal of the fossil fuels?
We have 1.5 degrees.
Okay. Okay, well, let's.
A lot, 1.6.
1.6, okay. Let's pull all these levers all the way down and totally remove them from our sources of primary energy and see what happens, right? A little bit lower. A little bit lower. And a little bit lower. But not necessarily where we were all hoping to be, right? Which means that it's possible, especially if we think back to the bathtub, right? We can totally drop all of these emissions, you know. I mean, we can make immediately substantial drops in the actual emissions that are going into the atmosphere. However, we still have a full bathtub that we need to empty. So just completely cutting off through reducing the usage, highly taxing it, it doesn't completely alleviate all of the issues, correct? And so there still needs to be additional systemic choices that are made. And since we had it seems to be a fairly in-depth discussion relating to population and economic growth, let's find out if, based on economic growth as GDP per individual, say it continues to accelerate, and say the population continues to accelerate, what do you think the impacts of both of these could be to the overall temperature numbers? Any guesses? All right, I don't have any guesses. I don't have any guesses either. So we're going to crank up both of these to find out. That is one great thing about scenarios, is that we're not actually changing this in real life, right? Starts curving back up, although we see that renewables gain an even larger market it kind of negates a lot of the actions that were already started. But even surprising to me, it doesn't accelerate it as much as I had guessed in my own mind. So there's still opportunities. So there's still opportunities to bring the numbers down. And so just how we talked about in some of these slides beforehand, what are other possible opportunities when we think about the industrial interactions and we think about the full range of greenhouse gases and even land use? What are some other opportunities that we could look at to try to continue to reduce the number?
Also, we have one question in the chat that maybe it would be important to clarify that. I don't understand how we manipulate carbon price independently of oil, coal, gas taxations. They're the same thing.
Not necessarily. So your carbon price is how much carbon dioxide you're releasing, right? The taxation and removal of natural gas is the actual acquisition and use of it. While it's, of course, so the carbon tax would be essentially when it's being burned, right? These taxes are the actual taxing for drilling it, taxing for buying it, taxing for burning it. Does that make sense? So like it's essentially kind of a before and after. Right? So with coal, it's the discouraging of mining it. It's the discouraging of burning it. Once it's burned, again, that's when the CO2, that's when the majority of the CO2 is released. Now you can start talking about some indirect CO2 with it, especially for, like, say, the transport of some of the fuels, but they are for all intents and purposes in this situation, the before and after and separate. Did that clarify that? Okay. And so we still have a little bit of time to try to continue to get our numbers down. So again, if we think about the full systems and what we're doing, what we're utilizing, whether it be how we're getting these materials from point A to point B, how we get ourselves from point A to point B, what other greenhouse gases are being released, and how the land is being used, and the possibilities of other removal technologies. Can I get any opinions on what they think would be the next important step in creating this scenario of reducing our temperature?
I have some ideas.
Yeah.
I have been playing with the application directly, and what I see has a strong impact is to stop deforestation and maximize afforestation, and also increasing the efficiency of the energy efficiency of buildings and electrifying buildings.
Okay. Fabulous. Well, we will use your opinion and we will remove deforestation, increase afforestation, and increase the efficiency and electrifications. And does anybody want to guess, with those 4 steps, what the possible temperature reduction could be.
I see 0.7.
Okay. So we've highly reduced that. Probably increase that. Probably increase the efficiency. And we have completely electrified. So are these, pardon me, my battery just dropped. So are these some of the temperature responses that you were expecting, and why or why not?
Oh, and I forgot also electrification of transport.
We can do that.
And another step that has been mentioned a couple of times in the chat is to lower the methane emissions.
Absolutely. Methane is, I don't think, discussed enough when it comes to the impact it has in global warming. And so let's totally drop that too and see where we land. Is anybody surprised with these overall results? Or have any opinions relating to them?
It looks as if those have almost a stronger impact than renewables. On the other hand, I think capturing methane is very difficult, because what escapes from the permafrost, how do you capture that? I mean, capturing from landfills and, you know, man-made sources seems to be workable, but
yeah, but for
Absolutely.
flaring, I mean, a lot of the extractives these days, they have flaring, and that's the biggest methane source as we speak today. And funny enough, if we go into the finance industry, a lot of people are de-investing from fossil fuels, and it's usually private equity that buys it, and then flaring goes up, and that could be seen from the radars. The other one is, by the way, nitrous oxide, which is often related to cars and is in a few orders of magnitude stronger still than methane.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, and there are situations, because, for example, the technology is, as was mentioned, not currently there for us to capture every type of greenhouse gas. I mean, we're just now starting to see possible scalable examples of carbon capture, which we haven't even included in this scenario. But I think a big goal is the overall reduction in the sources that are creating the release in the first place. And that includes agriculture, fertilizers, a lot of agricultural related situations that happen on an industrial scale is where you see a lot of these that are mentioned. And I did go ahead and just pull up the details. And so you do have the availability to, again, go into this and really start targeting the types of places where these emissions are, again, which is fabulous, especially if we're talking about ways to adjust the way your particular business could go forward, or if we're talking policy and change situations. So we can start to really delve deeper into the whys and the hows. And then, like I said, we didn't even go into some of the technology for the actual removal process. which I would like to see, just out of curiosity, what the increase of that would be. So, you know, for today's situation, for all, again, intents and purposes, for playing out scenario options based on some of our own personal viewpoints, that even with an increase in population, or an increase in economic growth, there is still combinations of possibilities for what we can do now, as well as what further technology can continue to allow us to do to reach these numbers, right? And to create a situation that we can alter our future with multiple stakes in multiple situations. And then we are going to share this scenario with all of you, so y'all can look at what we've done, and y'all can continue to play, tinker, or share it as much as you would like. But what I am going to do now, because we're kind of closing in on our about last 20 minutes, is I am going to stop sharing, and I would like to kind of have a little bit of a debriefing conversation and get some of your feedbacks about how this tool could be useful, not only in your leadership roles as in climate reality, but in your own networks, businesses, and initiatives. And so I would love to hear some feedback from some people. How do you think that these things could be? How do you think this tool could be used?
I'm having an idea right now. For example, I belong to a local association, you know, concerned with sustainability, and doing a similar session, but live, I mean in person, as part of one of the programs of this association, and with inviting the public to provide their input and guesses and whatnot.
Absolutely, because it's also a great way to kind of reinforce that the science, right? And again, at minimum, it is a way to prompt conversations, you know, and to prompt discussions, and to just enlighten people, and also, again, you know, provide that level of hope that it is possible, and maybe broaden perspectives of things that people may not have considered, or assumptions that they have that maybe science, you know, can either reinforce or refute assumptions. So I think that's absolutely a good way to engage a community organization. Does anybody else have any other examples of possible opportunities of how they can utilize it within their own networks? One thing that I really found that I see a big relevance for me in my own particular networks and professional and academic goals is not only the educational element that we discussed, but helping to plan from a consulting perspective, helping to align businesses' goals of increased energy efficiency or just overall sustainable development with what can actually make the most changes, right? So if there's depending on the size of the company and the ability to invest, the ability to upgrade, what strategy and steps would make the most effective sense, not only for short term, but for long term. As we discussed in some of these scenarios, like there's technological options, but they're not scalable yet. And so if they are available, they're extremely expensive, right? Things like afforestation. Love trees, always going to plant them. However, if you are planting especially indigenous trees in a particular area, they can take anywhere from 10 to 25 years to maturate, right? So it's not going to be an instant solution, right? Let's see, we have a couple. Yeah, absolutely. Progression of consulting. Yeah, and the complexity, right? I mean, and that's why I did try to introduce just this idea of systems thinking, and a lot of people, especially once you get to the level of you want to be a climate reality leader, you get involved with the sustainable development conversation. Systems thinking is becoming more relevant as a tool to try to understand it, right? And I think that this is a very good visual aid to show how those strategies can work and how things interplay. Again, especially if you start digging into some of the other graphs. I generally choose for these shorter sessions to not overwhelm and inundate with the 50 different options, and I use that as a very general number. That's not the exact number, but I try not to overload, right, with the visual stimuli. I try instead to direct the focus of the conversation. Yeah, absolutely. For decision making, there's a lot of information on their website as well about how they're starting to involve more policymakers, more politicians in seeing, okay, you want to support this particular agenda or proposal, but here's the science, here's what the science is saying that will actually do, and it either will, won't, or it's negligible, right? So again, just I think that's another benefit, because it's broad range and it's easy enough. It doesn't overwhelm the non-scientist, right? And I am going to, again, provide in our follow-up the full user guide to the Inroads. So, I mean, it really gets deep into the science. But sometimes that's much for people, a lot of times, especially depending on the audience that you're talking to, you have to meet people where they are, right? And so I think that this is another very valuable tool when choosing, when trying to meet people where they are, with whether it be their own special interests, their own agendas, and their own understanding. Yeah, absolutely. We had another comment from an individual working with circular design, and I think that I agree that it could be extremely useful in decision making and deciding on roadmaps, and investing, and that's a huge one. I'm actually on my school board for the university that I go to. I mean, and I'm actually gonna have a meeting here soon, and that's one of the big topics, is the investment portfolio, and how we can look at that and compare it against, what is the value, what is the intrinsic value of the money creation here, right? So with these last few minutes, I have another question that I want you to think about, and feel free to speak out or add to the chat. But what was one of the more surprising elements about this tool, possibly something that you weren't expecting, or whether it be a lever that you didn't think that would be included, or the number, the temperature changes that actually took place when we press different levers.
Actually, we have another question on using this tool on a local level. So one of the participants is working at the local level, city and country level, and does the tool allow to stimulate local contribution towards global goals?
So it has limited availability to zero in on a particular geographic region. Now, there are some maps, especially when it comes to the impact maps, that can show that. But within the Climate Interactive suite of tools, there is another one called EnRoads, and it's just the letter C, roads, and it looks at things for more of a continent, country. I believe it breaks down into regions, but I know country at minimum. So there are other ways to drill down and get a little bit more geographically specific. But I think that within this tool, I think that it also can provide some insight on that level, just because you could see how your regional decisions can impact the broader global scope, right? Because at the end of the day, there's no one size fits all, right? And every geographical location, whether we break it down into watersheds to countries, however we want to break it down, they all need their own recipe, right? And combinations of situations based on a multitude of social, environmental, and political factors. But we can see with the tool how we can add to that. But I do highly suggest, and then I will also make a note for just some of our follow-up information to provide a link to all of the tools that Climate Interactive currently offers. I will also say that out of all of them, I believe that this is the most robust one. The other ones are still very good, and I highly recommend them. But as far as just the ability to drill down with some of these issues, I think that this is a one of the better ones. Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I just got a chance to go see to open up the chats as well. And yeah, I can definitely see that the surprise that we don't always get the results that we expect, right? One of the first times I did it, I was convinced that getting rid of stopping deforestation and just planting trees like crazy that's all that we needed, right? And science proved me wrong. No, that particular situation, not only is it maturation rates that I talked about earlier, it's land uses and the amount of land that is actually needed for that particular effort as a one-off to be the most impactful. And yeah, we can turn off, you know, I see another one that they were surprised that so much reduction in the fossil fuels didn't actually change it that much. And again, between the bathtub effect and the fact that there still are reserves all over the world, that it's going to take a while before we go through. Even if we stopped digging and pumping today, it's still going to take at least a couple of decades, at least, to get through the reserves that are already sitting on standby, and creating the infrastructure where it's needed to transition, especially countries and regions that are solely dependent upon that for their sources of energy. Yeah, and it can't, and and hopefully, some of the surprise was not disheartening, right? Because this is a situation that we are all aware. It's a completely complex situation, but we have to have hope, right? Because there are capabilities. I mean, we saw it in our scenario. There are capabilities, and there are ways in which we can move forward. So I hope that once some of the shock wears off that may come from just our own personal viewpoints of what we assumed is the only right way, once that kind of wears off, that we see that, oh, okay, it's still a good way, it's just not the only way, right? And that we need to diversify, we need that variety, and we need advocation for a multitude of options. I can definitely, we have another comment. There's a quick question. Can you play with this tool anytime for free? Absolutely. It is free and openly available for any and everybody. Now there is a certain step and procedure and training if you want to become an ambassador for the Inroads, but it is not required. It is not required to open it up and play and share and test theories and assumptions. I can also see we have a couple more questions. So how can we climate leaders in our communities best help this initiative? I'm a big fan of communication and education, right? We need to talk about it with everybody involved in our own spheres of influence, right? And we need to provide opportunities for them to see firsthand. We can all be told information over and over again, right? Until we see some sort of personal ramification or understand it in our own way, it's hard for us sometimes as just humans to create the action that is necessary, right? But I think the first step is definitely the dialogue and the openness and being willing to talk about it, and also willing to ask questions to better understand where your particular audience and your sphere is coming from, right? Because A, we don't know what we don't know, and B, it takes lots of seeds to plant a garden, right? And so we have to sprinkle the knowledge when and where we can, and I'm very much an advocate, especially in situations to where people are on the fence, the idea of polarized opinions is becoming an increasingly big deal in many parts of the world, right? And I'm not particularly one to argue and bang my head against the wall, I'm much rather look for those individuals that are still open to the ideas and the science and the possibility and the opportunities, right? And then I also think that there is an opportunity within tools like this and within our climate reality training to change the narrative, right? That we can turn it into hope and we can turn it into possibilities, you know, because there's a lot of scenarios that are scary out in the world right now, you know, when it comes to climate change and when it comes to our ability to accept and act, right? And when messages are constantly focused on doom, gloom, complete apocalypse, it's not the most motivating thing for people. Some people, yes. Broad range, from a psychological perspective, that's not the most effective way to pull people into action. You know, people need to know that and feel like that there is still the opportunity to change. They can still plant their own garden, right? With the tools and the knowledge. And I think that this is a good way to do it, because I've never given one of these scenarios where people weren't visibly excited when the number dropped and visibly kind of bummed or disheartened a little bit when it didn't, right? I mean, and so it's also a pertinent tool to reinforce that. And just like within the slideshow I gave, all of those slides came from either the our climate reality leadership slide toolkit or climate interactive, you know, and all of that is openly and publicly available for anyone along with this tool. So I think that that's I don't think that we need to reinvent the wheel in trying to advance our own initiatives within our own networks and spheres of influence. We only have a couple of minutes left. Does anybody like to share their closing thoughts or opinions?
Hi, Jayanna. This is Gosha from the Climate Reality Europe branch team. So I'm not sure if anybody wants to chip in and share their remarks, but I just wanted to say a few words, mostly to thank you so much for leading this session, for delivering this workshop for us. I think you're a wonderful facilitator, and it's been really great to hear about how can we use the EnRoads tool. So I'm really hoping that all of our participants would actually have learned something during today's session, had the opportunity to discuss their ideas, and then we'll just take them away and share them within their circles of influence. So I hope that this has been inspiring for all of you. And thanks again, Jayanna, for taking the lead on this and for taking the initiative here. So thanks again.
Absolutely. And yes, and thank you everybody for coming. This is something that hopefully we will get a chance to do again in the future. And in the coming days, y'all will receive a follow-up from us because we always want to improve. And myself, as well as just the business interest group of pertainable information. So we will have a short questionnaire with just getting some feedback and then all the pertinent links that I mentioned. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you all so much for your participation.